The truce between Hamas and Israel ended after 7 days. Now, in that time, Hamas and other militants in Gaza released more than 100 hostages, mostly Israelis, in return for the release of more than 240 Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails. Extensions of the truce were negotiated with international help, first and foremost from a tiny Arab emirate whose unique influence over Hamas has attracted international attention.
Citizens of Israel break into cheers as a convoy brings a 79-year-old hostage home. Joy also in the West Bank, as Palestinians welcome women and children who were released from an Israeli jail. To get to this point required a flurry of diplomatic activity, involving 3 key international players. Number 1, Qatar. The country's leadership has direct contact with Hamas. Since 2012, it's hosted an overseas office for them. Hamas chief Ismail Haniyeh and several other top members live in the Gulf Emirate. And Qatar has used this fact to exert influence over the EU and US designated terrorist organization.
Well, we in Qatar have a unique position that a lot of countries around the world don't have. Since the United States requested that we open this channel with Hamas, we have a working relationship with them, and we are hopeful that through the abilities that we have, that we can do things that others can do around the region. And to be fully honest, we have been attacked for being able to speak to Hamas, being able to speak to Iran, being able to speak to the Taliban, being able to speak to Russia at times. But somebody has to make these difficult discussions. Somebody has to be able to say, I'm going to cross the line and make the discussions that will bring about peace. Peace doesn't happen unless there is dialogue.
Peace didn't happen, but a pause in fighting did. Also through dialogue with Israel, a country with which Doha has no official diplomatic relations. Behind closed doors, Qatar's Prime Minister has hosted the chiefs of both US and Israeli intelligence agencies. And last weekend, a jet carrying Qatari officials made its way to Israel. An historic first and extraordinary moment for the two countries. The talks in Israel are said to have been instrumental in saving the original truce and extending it. Mediator number 2, the United States. Israel's most important ally has facilitated dialogue with Middle Eastern mediators and has been pushing hard for further extensions to the ceasefire. On Thursday morning, the US Secretary of State touched down in Tel Aviv for the 4th time since the conflict escalated. His stated goal, a longer-term solution for Israel and Gaza.
This process is producing results. It's important, and we hope that it can continue.
The weight of Washington's influence has been evident from the start. The first 2 hostages who were released long before the hostages for prisoners deal took effect were US citizens. But Blinken's latest trip wasn't enough to prevent a resumption of fighting. Mediator number 3, Egypt. The country has opened its border with Gaza to receive hostages released by Hamas and allowed trucks to deliver humanitarian aid to Gaza as part of the truce. In front of the cameras and behind closed doors, Egypt has also been involved in diplomatic negotiations. Analysts say that Egypt's influence on the Israeli-Palestinian issue isn't what it once was, but its interest in ending the fighting in Gaza remains. Cairo doesn't want to take in the hundreds of thousands of people the war has displaced.
For more, I'm now joined by Hans-Jakob Schindler. He's a former German diplomat and a Middle East expert. He's currently a senior director at the Counter-Extremism Project. Mr. Schindler, it's good to have you here in the studio with us. Tell us more about the communication channels between Israel and Hamas in these negotiations. Nothing is official here, right?
Good evening. Thanks for having me. No, there is no direct contact. So this goes via Qatar. Of course, we've seen Israeli officials, including high-ranking intelligence officials, traveling from and to Doha. But really, Qatar is here the go-in between Israel and Hamas.
And so who's talking to whom then?
Qatar talks to Hamas.
Yeah.
Egypt, parallel, and not in Doha, also talks to Hamas.
How difficult is communication between Israel and Hamas with all of these negotiators involved? I mean, do you have almost too many people whispering in the background?
Well, this is the same challenge you have always when you have indirect negotiations, right? You need to be sure that your intermediator is absolutely trustworthy. And on the Qatari side, I would say there is a lack of that one, whether you actually get told the truth of what the other side wants. And also you need to make sure that your intermediary understands what you want the other side to understand, and vice versa. So it's more complex, but as Israel, how could they talk directly to Hamas unless it's on a very operational, very direct intelligence level?
One very important Middle East player with a lot of influence on Hamas is missing, it seems, and I'm talking about Iran. Why is that?
Iran really is trying to take advantage of this situation, right? You've seen what Hezbollah does in the north, but it just does enough to keep Israel busy. But Iran, who could, with one word, set Hezbollah loose on Israel, because Hezbollah is beholden to Iran, is essentially preserving its asset. On the other hand, the Houthis in Yemen, also a proxy of Iran, is also doing the little that is possible to keep everyone busy. So Iran is trying to position itself to get maximum benefit out of this particular situation.
When we talk about proxies, I mean, how should we understand that? Does Hamas, do they look to Tehran for maybe de facto permission to do things, for example, or is the connection not quite that stringent?
I mean, if you look at what happens on the 7th of October, it really has the handwriting of Iran, right? What Hamas did until this pogrom-like attack was very different methodologically as far as the terrorist attack is concerned. It was smaller-scale terror attacks, suicide bombings, but not a concerned multi-hour, multi-day military-style terror attack that killed everyone that was inside. So that is really the classic tactics that Iran has taught the militias in Iraq, that has taught the Hezbollah, how it's operating in Syria. So absolutely, Hamas is beholden to Iran, not only for the supply of weapons and ammunition, but also for money.
And what is going on inside Gaza? I mean, Hamas is not the only player. I'm thinking of Islamic Jihad, for example. Is Hamas, does it have to make sure that all of these players are on the same page?
I think there's two levels here, right? So if you're talking about who holds more hostages and how can, the next level of the negotiations be achieved and how could that go? Yes, then Hamas has competitors, in inverted comma, chiefly the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who is a much smaller, cell-structured terrorist organization, but who has no political sway in Gaza of any significant size. And then there are some of these quasi-criminal groups that also hold hostages. But when it comes to military decision-making in Gaza, there really is only Hamas.
The first deal between Israel and Hamas is now history. Fighting is resumed. The U.S., they've made it very clear that they expect Israel to protect ordinary people in Gaza more than we've seen in the past. I mean, that pressure is definitely stronger than before. How much leverage does Washington have right now?
Washington, I'm pretty sure, is the only one who has actual leverage over Israel. And you've seen a few more additional attempts by Israel to demonstrate that it's trying to protect civilians. The IDF, the Israeli military, released a map in which the entire Gaza Strip is divided into zones, and they will announce the number of the zone where the attack happens. Unusual for a military to tell its adversaries publicly where they're going to attack next. The price that they're willing to pay in order to make sure that as little as possible civilians going to be affected by these attacks. Of course, that also means Hamas fighters are not going to be necessarily in these areas anymore.
Let me ask you to look into your crystal ball. How long do you think that the fighting will continue until we have another ceasefire or another agreement in place?
That is really hard to tell. It was very clear that this was just phase one. I always said this is the confidence-building phase. Can you actually do a deal and operationalize a deal? Both sides have kept their word until the very end. Then Hamas played around with the number of hostages went down. It had a terror attack in Jerusalem. Now, Unfortunately, Hamas had to end this because Hamas wants more from Israel than just 3 Palestinians per prisoner.
Final question for you. Who is in a stronger position now compared to when the ceasefire started? Israel or Hamas?
It's really hard to tell. I don't think the relative differences have really militarily shifted to a great deal. Yeah. Israel is in a very good position to fully control the north of Gaza soon, but Hamas, as we have seen in the last couple of hours, is still able to hit back.
Mr. Schindler, as always, good to have you here in the studio. We appreciate your analysis. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Gershon Baskin is an Israeli peace activist and Middle East analyst, and he helped negotiate the release of Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit in 2011. And he joins us now from Jerusalem. Now, the fighting unfortunately has resumed. What does that mean for the people still being held hostage in Gaza and their chances of being released?
It certainly makes it much more difficult to negotiate. People being bombed in Gaza and Hamas is on the run. Israel is after the Hamas leadership. Israel is also certainly beginning search and rescue operations to find the hostages being held probably underground in Gaza, in the south of Gaza. It doesn't fare well for the hostages that more negotiations and more ceasefires are not active right now to
We are having a bit of trouble with the audio line there. Let me ask my next question. Do negotiations even continue under these circumstances?
There are negotiations that are continuing. This is what we've been told. They are taking place in Qatar and in Egypt. They're at a slower pace as the fighting has resumed. I guess everyone's trying to see what will happen now. What will Hamas's reaction be to the renewed fighting? The deal ended because Hamas stopped providing Israel with a list of hostages it was ready to release. The fighting could have been postponed. The deal could have continued. More hostages could have been released and more Palestinian prisoners could have been released. But this was a choice of Hamas not to continue with the deal, and they are suffering the
Now, with the majority of the elderly women, mothers and children among the Israeli hostages released, mostly men and soldiers are now left in Gaza. Does that set the bar for potential further agreements even higher?
There are still 17 women and children left amongst the Israeli hostages. Certainly when we're down to young men who Hamas considers soldiers, the price will be much, much different than it was until now, which was 3 prisoners for every hostage. Hamas has already said that their goal is to empty the Israeli prisons from Palestinian prisoners. The latest count I've heard is that there are 7,600 who are serving life sentences for murder, who were captured in Israel on October 7th. It will be a very difficult, if not impossible, negotiation to conduct with Hamas's demands being like that. Israel is very unlikely to agree to them, although I imagine that Israel will want to pursue the negotiations while the military actions and search and rescue operations are on.
Gershon Baskin there, an Israeli peace activist and Middle East analyst. Thank you very much.